There's a moment that happens to millions of people somewhere around year 3 or 4 of their corporate career. The raise comes through. Maybe it's 4%, maybe 5%. The manager smiles across the conference table, slides a paper forward, and says something like, "We really value what you bring to this team." And for a few hours, maybe a whole weekend, it feels like progress. It feels like the system is working exactly the way it was supposed to work. Then something shifts, quietly, without announcement. The rent goes up. The car payment adjusts. The wardrobe gets a small refresh because the new title demands it. A few dinners that used to feel like a treat become routine. And by the time the next performance cycle rolls around, that raise has dissolved so completely into the texture of daily life that it might as well have never arrived. The number on the paycheck is higher. The feeling is identical. This isn't a story about people making bad decisions. It isn't about financial irresponsibility or a lack of discipline. It is about something far more structural, a ceiling that most corporate employees are never shown, never warned about, and never taught to recognize until they're already pressing their heads against it. Stay with me through this, because what I'm about to walk you through fundamentally changed the way I understand employment, compensation, and the math behind building actual financial independence. And I think it will do the same for you. Let's begin with a number that almost nobody talks about honestly. The median annual raise for salaried employees in the United States has hovered between 3 and 4% for most of the last decade. In 2023, with inflation running hot, some surveys showed average raises climbing toward 5.5%. But here's the number that matters more than any of those. The average annual inflation rate over the same 10-year period sits just below 3%.
Do the math slowly.
If you're receiving a 4% raise and inflation is running at 3%, your real purchasing power is growing by roughly 1% per year. On a $75,000 salary, that's $750 of genuine economic progress annually. Before taxes, that's the ceiling. Not a glass ceiling of the type that gets discussed in boardrooms. A mathematical ceiling. A structural constraint built directly into how corporate compensation works. One that, by design, keeps the cost of labor rising just slowly enough to feel like progress, while actually keeping most employees in nearly the same economic position year after year for the entirety of their working lives. Now here's where it gets important.
Because this isn't just about the math.
The salary ceiling operates through two mechanisms that work in combination, and understanding both is the only way to see the full picture. The first mechanism is what economists call wage compression. Most large corporations operate on salary bands, internal ranges that define the minimum and maximum pay for every role. When you're hired, you typically enter a band somewhere in the lower to middle portion. And raises, no matter how enthusiastic your manager's language, are constrained by that band's upper limit. A study published by the Wharton School found that companies spend roughly 10% of payroll on raises annually, but that spending is distributed across all employees, meaning the effective raise for any individual is far smaller than it sounds. And because bands have ceilings, once you approach the top of your salary range, your raise percentages begin shrinking, not because your performance declined, but because the band ran out of room. The second mechanism is what happens when you move between levels. Promotions, which are the traditional escape valve from wage compression, come with their own catch. When you're promoted from one band to the next, you typically enter the new band at or near its bottom, which means you traded your position near the ceiling of your old range for a position near the floor of your new one. You're starting the compression cycle over again, just one rung higher. This is why career coaches talk about the difference between lateral income and exponential income. Lateral income is what the corporate ladder provides. Each step moves you slightly higher, but the architecture of the ladder itself contains the trajectory. I want to be precise about something here because nuance matters. Not every corporate role is identical. Not every company operates the same way. There are industries, investment banking, certain engineering specializations, pharmaceutical sales, where compensation structures are dramatically more aggressive. And there are individual employees who navigate the system exceptionally well, using competing offers, strategic lateral moves, and the leverage of specialized skills to grow their income faster than the average. But the data on the median tells a different story than the exceptions do. According to research from the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, the fastest wage growth consistently comes from job switching, not from staying at the same employer. In the years between 2020 and 2023, job switchers saw average wage growth of between 7 and 9%, roughly double the raise rate of workers who stayed put. The Fed's wage growth tracker, which follows this data monthly, has consistently shown this gap for over a decade, which means the ceiling isn't imaginary, it's measurable, and it applies most aggressively to the people who do exactly what they were told to do: work hard, stay loyal, take the annual review seriously, and trust that the process will reward patience. Now, let's talk about why this matters at the scale of a lifetime. Because the numbers become genuinely alarming when you extend them out. Imagine two people beginning their careers at the same company on the same day, each earning $60,000. Person A stays with the company for 30 years, receiving average annual raises of 3.5%. Person B leaves every 4 to 5 years, negotiating an average jump of 15% each time they move. After 30 years, Person A earns approximately $169,000, which sounds like substantial career progress. It took 3 decades, but they more than doubled their salary. The raises compounded. The system worked. Person B, however, is earning north of $400,000 at year 30. The gap between these two outcomes isn't a rounding error or a hypothetical constructed to prove a point. It's the mathematical consequence of two entirely different relationships with how compensation grows. The tragedy isn't that Person A lacked ambition. The tragedy is that Person A was playing a game where the rules were never clearly explained. Let me bring this down to the level of lived experience, because raw numbers alone can feel abstract. There is a particular trap that catches high performers specifically, and this is where it gets uncomfortable because high performers are typically the last people who expect to find themselves trapped. In most corporate environments, the highest rated employees receive the largest percentage raises, which sounds logical. Rewarding performance is the stated goal of the entire system. But in practice, the highest performers are also the most valuable to retain, which means their managers are deeply motivated to keep them in their current roles. The better you perform, the more valuable you become in the seat you're already in. And the more valuable you are in that seat, the less incentive the organization has to disrupt the arrangement by promoting you or structuring a compensation breakthrough. This is sometimes called the high performer trap. You become too valuable to lose and, in the same breath, too embedded to advance quickly. The very thing the system asks you to do, excel, is also the thing that most reliably anchors you to it. Meanwhile, the employees who leave for competitors or negotiate lateral moves into adjacent industries are the ones capturing the premium that performance alone was supposed to provide. This is the right moment to address something that comes up whenever the subject is raised. The argument that stability has value, that benefits, pensions where they still exist, and job security offset the slower compensation growth of long-term employment. It's a fair point, and it deserves an honest answer. Benefits are real, and they have monetary value. Employer-sponsored health insurance, 401k matching, paid time off. These are compensation in a form that doesn't show up on the paycheck stub. And for many employees, particularly those with families or significant healthcare needs, these benefits meaningfully change the math. But there's a calculation that most employees never run. The average employer 401k match in the United States is between 3 and 4% of salary, according to Vanguard's annual How America Saves report. Employer health insurance contributions average roughly $7,000 annually per employee for individual coverage, according to the Kaiser Family Foundation. When you total the real value of standard benefit packages, you're typically looking at an additional 15 to 25% of base salary in compensation value. That's meaningful, but it doesn't close the gap we just walked through. A 30-year career of strategic job switching still produces dramatically higher total compensation, even accounting for potential benefit gaps during transitions and the periods of slightly higher personal health insurance costs. The math on benefits softens the ceiling. It doesn't eliminate it. So, why don't more people simply leave? If the data so clearly favors mobility, why do millions of talented employees spend decade after decade at the same organization, receiving the same category of raise, pressing quietly against the same invisible upper boundary? Several forces work against mobility, and they deserve honest examination rather than dismissal. The first is comfort masquerading as security. Long-tenure employees accumulate institutional knowledge, social capital, and a sense of professional identity that becomes genuinely hard to imagine replanting elsewhere. The familiar discomfort of a salary ceiling can feel preferable to the unfamiliar discomfort of starting over, even if starting over carries dramatically better financial outcomes. The second force is what behavioral economists call status quo bias. Human beings disproportionately weight potential losses against equivalent potential gains. The risk of something going wrong in a new role feels more vivid and immediate than the abstract benefit of higher earnings over a decade. The ceiling is invisible. The risk of change is not. The third force is deliberate. It is engineered into the retention systems that most large companies maintain. Vesting schedules that require 4 or 5 years before stock options or retirement contributions become accessible. Long-term incentive plans that perpetually reset the horizon. Benefits that are difficult to replicate without employer group coverage. These aren't accidents of corporate design. They are mechanisms specifically constructed to make the cost of leaving feel higher than the benefit of staying. Understanding this doesn't mean every company is acting in bad faith. Retention is a legitimate business interest. But employees who understand these mechanisms can make decisions about their own careers with open eyes rather than through the fog of systems designed to obscure the math. Here's where the conversation has to expand beyond just salary, because the ceiling isn't only about what your employer pays you. It's about what becomes possible or impossible, depending on whether you ever break through it. The compounding effect of income operates across every dimension of wealth building. Higher income means more available capital for investing. More capital invested earlier means dramatically larger retirement portfolios through compounding. Larger retirement portfolios mean more financial independence options at younger ages. More financial independence options mean the ability to take risks, entrepreneurial, personal, relational, that generate still further wealth. The salary ceiling isn't just a ceiling on compensation. It's a ceiling on the entire downstream architecture of financial life. Every year spent below it is a year of compounding that never happened, investment capital that was never deployed, and options that were never created. The people who build genuine wealth inside the corporate structure, not just high incomes, but actual wealth, almost universally have one of 3 characteristics. They systematically invest an aggressive percentage of their income, regardless of its size. They build skills and credentials that give them genuine leverage in compensation negotiations. Or they treat employment as a vehicle with a specific destination rather than a permanent arrangement, making strategic moves before the ceiling settles in above them. Usually, it's a combination of all 3. Now, let's talk practically. Because identifying a problem without offering a coherent path forward is just frustration dressed up as insight. The single most powerful lever most employees underuse is the competing offer. Research published in compensation journals consistently shows that the most effective tool for breakthrough salary growth inside an existing employer is a documented, credible offer from a competitor. Not a rumored one. Not a vague implication. An actual, written offer from a legitimate company at a materially higher number. This works for a specific reason. It forces the organization to make a financial argument against its own compensation system. When a manager advocates for a raise within the normal cycle, they're pushing against budgets, band limits, and approval chains. When an employee presents a competing offer, the conversation shifts to retention risk, which is a different kind of organizational urgency entirely. Companies that will not move their salary structure for internal advocacy will sometimes move it substantially to prevent losing someone critical. This is uncomfortable for people who were raised to value loyalty. But it is simply how corporate compensation markets function at the margin. The second lever is skill specificity. The employees who consistently command premium compensation share a characteristic. They have cultivated expertise that is both genuinely valuable and genuinely scarce. Broad competence inside a corporate role is easier to replace, and therefore easier to underpay. Specific expertise at the intersection of 2 or 3 specialized domains creates a supply and demand situation that most salary bands weren't built to contain. The third lever is timing. Corporate compensation is much more negotiable at 2 specific moments than at any other time: when you are initially offered a role and when you hold a documented competing offer. Both are moments of leverage. Every other moment is a moment of institutionalized process, which operates in the employer's favor. If you're currently inside a long tenure at a company where compensation has grown incrementally, the honest advice is this: run the numbers. Compare where your total compensation sits today against what the external market would offer for your specific combination of experience and skills. If there is a gap, and there almost certainly is, that gap is the salary ceiling made visible in dollars. There's one final dimension to this that I think is the most underappreciated, and I want to make sure we spend real time on it before we close. The salary ceiling affects psychology in ways that extend far beyond the financial. Employees who spend years inside a structure that limits their earning growth without naming or explaining that limit often internalize the limitation as personal. They conclude that the ceiling they're pressing against is a reflection of their value rather than the structure's design. This has consequences that are almost impossible to overstate. It shapes how people present themselves in interviews. It determines what they believe they can ask for in negotiations. It influences which opportunities they pursue and which they assume are beyond their reach. The salary ceiling, in other words, doesn't stay at work. It travels home. It sits inside the belief system and distorts the perception of what's possible. The most important shift isn't tactical. It isn't switching jobs on the right schedule or cultivating the right credentials. The most important shift is epistemic, understanding that the ceiling was never a reflection of worth. It was a feature of a system that had interests distinct from yours. Once that is genuinely understood, not just intellectually acknowledged but truly internalized, the entire conversation about careers, compensation, and financial possibility changes character. The ceiling is still real. The structural constraints of corporate compensation don't dissolve because you understand them. But you stop experiencing them as verdicts and start experiencing them as conditions to be navigated. And conditions can be navigated. Systems can be understood. Leverage can be built, used, and moved through to somewhere better. This is what I want to leave you with. Most of the people who will watch this are somewhere inside a corporate structure right now, maybe thriving inside it, maybe growing quietly frustrated with it, maybe just beginning to notice the pattern without having language for what they're seeing. If that's you, none of what I've laid out is a reason to panic or to make impulsive decisions about your career. It is a reason to look clearly. Run the external market comparison. Invest in the skills that create genuine leverage. Understand the mechanics of your own compensation band. Treat the next negotiation with the seriousness of someone who knows how the game is structured, because you now do. The ceiling is real, but it is not the roof. If this changed something in how you're thinking about your career and your money, the best thing you can do is share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to go deeper on the mechanics of building income that isn't constrained by a salary band, the strategies that actually compound over time, make sure you subscribe because that conversation is exactly where we're headed next.